Joints are regions of the body where the articular ends of adjacent bones are strongly supported by dense connective tissues. Joints are called synarthroses and permit various degrees of movement or no movement and can be fibrous or cartilaginous joints. I'm only going to describe a bone suture where no movement occurs and a diarthrotic joint which permits free movement. Let me first describe a diarthrotic joint. This is a section of the finger joint. You can see one articular surface of hyaline cartilage here and the other here. This section shows later stages of chondrogenic formation of an endochondral bone. It also shows the histological structure of a diarthrotic joint or freely movable joint, often called a synovial joint. And it also shows a variety of connective tissues. Let's begin with the first of these. This bone here shows both a primary and a secondary ossification centre, separated by an epiphyseal plate of pale bluish hyaline cartilage. The other bone over here is more advanced in its development. The epiphyseal plate has disappeared, and the two ossification centres have fused. It's even impossible to say exactly where the plate had been, because the primary and the secondary ossification centres have fused completely into a single marrow cavity. Here is an image of the epiphyseal plate viewed at a higher magnification than in the previous image. Endochondral bone formation takes place from both of its faces. However, this finger is from a young adult and its growth has dwindled to a snail's pace. The individual developmental zones in the epiphyseal cartilage have regressed to a minimum. Growth on this epiphyseal side is even slower than of the diaphyseal side here, and the stages are more abbreviated. Nevertheless, on the diaphyseal side, you can still see some longitudinally oriented lines of chondrocytes. Columns of calcified cartilage extend down into some of the bony spicules. There will be a thin layer of endosteum over most of the spicules and around the cavity in the diaphysis, but it's too difficult to resolve that in this image. The marrow in the spongy areas of this bone is all yellow marrow, basically fatty tissue. The articular surfaces of the two adjacent bone ends are covered with articular cartilage. These cartilages are stained redder than most of the other hyaline cartilages that you've looked at in the previous lecture series on cartilage. Perhaps the decalcification process has leached out much of the basophilic ground substance. The distinctive feature of articular cartilage is that it has a free surface, not covered by a perichondrium. So, the articulation involves two very smooth cartilage surfaces sliding across one another. The basal surfaces of these cartilages are directly attached to the underlying bone. Articular cartilage can be divided into at least 4 zones. A superficial zone is closest to the surface and is characterized by elongated or flattened chondrocytes. Type 2 collagen is arranged parallel to the surface, so this region is pressure resistant. An intermediate or transitional zone is below the superficial zone and contains more spherical chondrocytes distributed throughout the matrix. In the deeper or radial zone, spherical and smaller chondrocytes are arranged in short columns perpendicular to the articulating surface. Look very carefully and note a change in the staining or bluing of the cartilage matrix as it becomes calcified. This is the calcified zone. Here is a section through an additional joint. There is no epiphyseal cartilage left in this joint from a mature individual. Now let's look at the structure of the joint itself. A collar of ligament extending from one bone to the other holds the two bones together. Within it, the joint, or articular cavity, would be filled with synovial fluid and is bound by this joint or articular capsule. I won't show any image at a high magnification because the components of the articular capsule aren't well preserved, but it consists of this outer fibrous layer and this inner layer, which is the synovial membrane, specialized in places to secrete synovial fluid. Here, the epithelium is cuboidal to low columnar and is supplied by a rich plexus of very small blood vessels. A synarthrosis is a junction where two flat bones of the skull meet. The two bones are held together by a ligament of very dense fibrous connective tissue. Obviously, it's not a movable joint like in the finger joint you've just viewed. Its purpose is to attach the bones instead of encouraging movement. As you can see here, the opposing edges of the bones are very irregular, with a series of interdigitating projections and cavities. A narrow, ribbon-like ligament will normally run between these two bones. Now I'll describe a histological section through this suture. But first, it's important to understand the orientation of the section when I show it to you. The image of the suture I'm about to show you has been sectioned along its length, perpendicular to the surface of the skull. One bone would lie mainly in front of the plane of section and the other mainly behind it. Most of the bone tissue on the histological section I will show you now is from the front bone. In places, the section cuts into the ligament of the suture between the two bones. This gives these rounded islands or long profiles of dense connective tissue. In a few places, the section has dipped all the way through the ligament to graze the tip of protrusions of the other bone, here, here, and here. These bits of other bone show up as a small blob in the middle of islands of ligament. The bone tissue looks somewhat strange because its outer border is riddled with Sharpie's fibres. Also, it's sectioned parallel to and just below the surface of the bone. For some reason, the lamella near the surface have excessive amounts of ground substance and therefore a variegated bluish appearance. It's worthwhile examining the ligament with some care as it's been cut in various orientations across the section. In particular, with a bit of perseverance, I've found some transverse sections. Here you can see how large the bundles of fibres are. They form a mosaic pattern with the fibroblasts or fibrocytes squeezed in between them. By the way, this is what a tendon looks like in cross-section. Maybe you should go back and compare it with the longitudinal section of a tendon, which is dense, regular connective tissue, that I described in my earlier lecture on connective tissues.